Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Club Eisenhower podcast. I'm Todd Arrington, the director of the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas, and I'm very pleased to have with me today to talk about some really interesting and very important work. Welcome to Club Eisenhower, Dr. Derek Abbey, director of Project Recover. Is that your title, Derek? Did I get that right?
I'm the president and CEO of Project Recover, but I appreciate it, Todd. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor, truly.
Well, it's an honor to talk to you, and everyone will understand why here very shortly when we start talking about the work that your organization does. But if you don't mind, maybe just start off telling us a little bit about yourself and how did you come to be in this, like I said, really interesting and really important line of work.
Yeah, so I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, in and around the Seattle area, and kind of had a eventful childhood, which is I was raised by a single mom, and she did everything that she could to raise me when I was a little bit boy, and unexpectedly she passed away when I was 13. So,
Oh gosh, I'm sorry to hear.
yeah, but as you can expect, that was incredibly impactful moment of my life. But I was a teenager without a rudder or sail, and so when I was approaching adulthood, I made the decision to run off to the Marine Corps to find some purpose in life, a system I could succeed in, some discipline, which is what I needed. And the Marine Corps provided exactly what I needed. I ended up doing an entire career in the Marine Corps. It was very much a fairy tale type of career. I started off as an enlisted Marine, had a successful first tour as a communications Marine. And at the end of my first tour, I was selected for a commissioning program. The Marine Corps sent me to get my undergraduate degree and sent me to Oregon State University, where I earned a couple degrees in history and was commissioned a grounds officer on the backside of that and sent to the basic school where every Marine has to go for 6 months to learn how to be a junior level officer. And while I was there, I was selected for an aviation contract, which resulted in me being a part of a couple of fighter squadrons. But my first fighter squadron was VMFA AW 121, which had been around for a long time. And that was how I initially became connected to the Marine Corps. I ended up, spending the rest of my career doing a variety of things, but then I also was doing this work of Project Recover, and I became connected to the organization through some World War II cadre, just by happenstance. One day in 2003, I was in our squadron ready room when the phone rang, and I had just come back from a deployment. But on the other end of the phone was a gentleman named George Burianic, and he was a World War II veteran, and he was looking for contact information for other World War II veterans, and I happened to be the historical officer for the squadron, so I took the call, and we didn't have any of the contact information he was looking for, but I just asked him simply, what do you need the information for? And he said, well, every year we get together for a reunion in different spots of the country. I'm just trying to get as many people as I can. And this year we're doing it in Indiana. And I said, well, that sounds really cool. Can I come? And he said, absolutely, please. And so me and another Marine from the squadron took a Hornet, an F-18 Hornet out there to meet the old squadron. And it was an incredible experience, a connection of Marines across time. They were tell us about Iraq and F-18s, and we said, who cares about Iraq and F-18s? Tell us about World War II and Corsairs. And they said, who cares about World War II and Corsairs? And like I said, it was just a connection across time. And through that day, they said, you need to meet this gentleman named Pat Scannon. He's doing this work looking for Americans missing in action in the nation of Palau, which 121 flew out of Peleliu, which is an island of Palau, and some fierce fighting took place there. At the time, I wasn't completely conscious of all the air campaigns that took place there and how many people were missing, but Pat was doing work to locate these sites and the people that were missing. And but I missed him by 20 minutes that year, and so I worked with those World War II veterans to have another reunion the following year. But I said, this time let's do it in San Diego, and we'll have the old squadron and the new squadron together. And that was when I met Pat Scannon for the first time, and him and I became fast friends. And at the time, the organization was called the Bent Prop Project, and he invited me to be a member of the organization, and it seemed like the right thing to do. I had no idea what I would do to support the mission or advance the mission, but I was there to carry heavy things or do whatever they wanted, and became a member of the organization. And I couldn't fathom that 20-something years later, you and I'd be sitting here talking about the work that we're doing in this worldwide effort that's taking place related to missing in action by some pretty incredible people. But yeah, so I spent a career in the Marine Corps, 23 years total. I did everything you could possibly want to do in an F-18 community. I actually left the F-18 community after an extended amount of time and helped create and stand up Marine Special Operations Command, specifically what was the West Coast Battalion, which is now they're all on the East Coast, and got some education in the Marine Corps, got everything that I wanted that young teenager needed, and retired in 2014. And besides working in Project Recover, I've done a lot of work in the higher education space, working with the military population, accessing and succeeding in higher education, running programs at San Diego State University and University of San Diego. And for about 5.5 years now, I've been the president and CEO of Project Recover.
Great. Wow. Well, it sounds like you've had a very long and impressive career. Thank you for your service as well.
And you as well.
So tell me now, how does this process work? What does Project Recover need to start I don't even know the proper terminology. I apologize. Whether it's an investigation or an attempted recovery or whatever the proper verbiage is there. But what do you guys need, and then what do you actually do? Do you guys go out into the field and actually conduct the searches?
Yeah, so it's a lot. And so we're a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to locate, ultimately repatriate American service members that are missing in action, both as a unilateral organization and now as a partner of the Department of Defense. But I like to say that this work starts in the basement of an archive somewhere. We have a full-time historian on our team that's constantly researching cases and building out cases related to the more than 81,000 American service members that remain missing in action from our previous wars, going back to World War II. And that's what we do. It starts in the building out these cases, doing this investigation and research to build these cases, and that is not only archives, but it's all sorts of means, and really any means. So it's doing the research in archives, but it's also hearing from families that have information related to their loved ones. It's doing research in the countries where these service members were lost, whether that's interviewing hunters or fishermen or combing their records. As time has passed, especially related to World War II losses, the firsthand accounts now are less and less, unlike what it was 20 years ago. And so we'll build out those cases and we'll add that to our caseload. And right now we probably have a database that includes about 700 cases associated with more than 3,000 missing Americans. And that's actionable cases, meaning if the resources are there, we'll take action on those. It's not this person was last seen heading west over the Pacific or something like that. This is, we have enough information to at least narrow it down to an area. And then we will prioritize those missions based on highest likelihood of success, ultimately access to the area, resources available, things like that. And we also do what we call campaigning. So we'll pick out regions of the world where there's a number of losses, so that we can continue to go back there. But also when we send people and equipment to work on these cases, we can work on multiple cases at a time. Unfortunately, it's not a cheap mission, but it's if we can get those people and equipment in place, we want to maximize those resources and do all that we can. And so that's the next step, is exactly that. We send teams into the field to do search missions. We work both in the underwater environment as well as the terrestrial environment. So depending on the area and the context and the environment that we're working on, we'll utilize different technologies and different approaches to the cases to do these searches. So if it's underwater, typically we're working with our partners at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography or the University of Delaware to utilize automated underwater vehicles to map the ocean floor in certain areas, find points of interest, and then investigate those points of interest to determine if they're associated with these losses. And usually these are aircraft losses. So we're looking for an aircraft. If we find an aircraft, is it the aircraft that we're looking for? Once we get to that point, we know exactly who might be associated with it. And then we'll fully document it. And that's the next phase, whether it's on land or water. We'll document these sites, and we document them with the intention of preserving the information related to the site, but also in preparation for an eventual recovery or an excavation. And then that's the next phase of the mission is that we conduct an excavation of the site. If it's on land, it's a traditional archaeological excavation that you might think of. We grid out the site. We have a lead archaeologist on hand, a number of other specialists to include a forensic anthropologist, and we'll go through every centimeter of that site trying to find anything related to the individual or individuals that are lost. And you just translate that to the underwater environment. When it's an underwater site, we're using typically our partners at Legion Undersea Services, who are mostly former Navy divers, but also some pretty incredibly capable people. But we do the same thing. We grid out the site underwater.
That must be hard.
It is very difficult. But then we basically use a big vacuum cleaner to suck up all the material from the site in these individual grids, and then we screen that using quarter mesh screen every single piece of it. Wow. to find these individuals and ultimately repatriate them back to the United States. And that's the intention of the excavations, whether it's on land or in the water. We're excavating the site to find any type of osseous material, human remains, but then of course any artifact that can assist with the identification. Dog tags, watches, rings, anything that might be able to assist with the identification. Everything else remains in place. So if it's an aviation crash site, we leave the airplanes and everything there at the site. We only want the people. The planes are a means to the people. And once we have all that, we coordinate through the host institution, and they have different agencies depending on where we might be working to work on creating the chain of custody that are going to get those remains when we recover them back to the U.S. And from there, they're typically going to go to a lab either in Hawaii or in Nebraska. That's where the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency has two separate labs where they will go through the identification officially, and they do that blindly to ensure that no mistakes are made. And then that's where our mission actually ends. We're a fully vertical organization within the space, meaning we do the mission from research all the way to the recovery. But Title 10 restricts identification to the Department of Defense agency, that DPA agency that I mentioned.
Does the Department of Defense also send teams out to do recoveries like this?
Yes.
And you guys work closely with them sometimes, or are you just all completely separate?
No. So there is an official Department of Defense agency. It's the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, DPAA as we refer to them. Most people refer to them. And that is their mission. Their mission is they have been tasked for accounting for these missing Americans going back to World War II. And so they do all of their organic work within the Department of Defense. But in 2015, they went through a restructure of that organization. And when they did that, they created the capacity to develop public-private partnerships. And Project Recover was one of the first organizations that they reached out to. We have been doing this work already for 2 decades prior to that, and had a relationship with the Department of Defense along this mission and their previous agencies, but it wasn't official. So we would actually feed information to them from the work that we were doing, but they were doing the recovery and the excavation work. And as they expanded and created these public-private partnerships, now it's allowed us to expand our mission. And so, yes, we do partner missions with them. We do all that work that I mentioned already unilaterally, but from time to time, they'll reach out to us to conduct any piece of that mission, whether it's research, search, documentation, recovery in both the underwater or terrestrial environment. But yeah, they'll ask us to do pieces of that, in which we're very proud to do.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's very interesting. I wanted to make sure I understood that your organization is not. It's obviously a nonprofit. It's not part of DoD, but I wanted to make sure I understood kind of how you guys work together if you do.
Yeah, it's a pretty complex mission, so I appreciate the question.
It sounds like it. And then once you do find remains and you get them back to the States, and then of course have to turn them over to one of those labs you mentioned a few minutes ago, I mean, it can still be years sometimes before the identifications are actually made, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, it can take some time, and it takes time for a variety of reasons. One, it's not always easy to make the identifications, and they use a variety of means to determine that ID of the individual or individuals that they're trying to identify. And they try to use as many as possible, because as you can imagine, if we can triangulate that information, it provides a more accurate identification and eliminates any potential mistakes. You don't want to make a mistake on who you're identifying and cause more harm than good ultimately with the families that we're working for. And so most people go directly to DNA when they're doing when they ask about identifications, and they absolutely are using more and more advanced DNA technology to identify any remains that are recovered. But they're also using things like dental records and examining skeletal remains for evidence that can point to this is the person. So if you have if the individual broke their left arm when they were young and there's evidence of that, that's something. I mentioned artifacts. If there's artifacts commingled with the remains, that's something else that helps with the identification. But if it's a multi-crew aircraft, you have to make sure that you're separating if in the event that they are commingled and things like that. If it's in water, there's a desalination process that they need to do that's going to help with the accuracy. But when it comes to DNA, they don't always have family samples. So can they narrow it down to a small group of people so that when they have to reach out to families, that they're reaching out to the right families to get the appropriate samples? So if they are reaching out to families and they don't have those samples, then there's the genealogy that's associated with that, which is something that Project Recover tries to do as well, so we can have potential next of kin that we can even deliver that information to DPAA to assist with the identification process. But it's a lot. They're working on a lot of cases, so that's another reason, just simple backlog. But it's also a pretty complex part of the mission. It's not necessarily always straightforward. If it's a perfect case where it's a preserved aircraft loss of some sort and it's a single piloted aircraft and this is the only person that we find with it, well, that helps with the process. But if it's a underwater site with a multi-crew aircraft that's twisted and mangled or something like that, well, then it can get a little bit more complicated and take more time.
This is fascinating. I'm so interested in this, and I'm a little bit jealous. This must be very rewarding work to do.
Yeah, as a veteran and as a veteran yourself, when somebody swears an oath to our Constitution and dons the cloth of our nation, we as collective Americans make a promise to that individual that we're going to do everything that we can to bring them home, and that promise doesn't have an expiration date after they're lost. And it's the fellow warrior to their left and right that's tasked with keeping that promise. And war is chaotic, as we know, and the result of that is there's more than 80,000 promises that have yet to be kept. But as somebody with a military background, this draws me to this mission. But it's not just veterans that are involved; it's just fellow Americans and actually people from around the world. We have people from other countries that advance this mission because of the human element that draws them to it, and the opportunity to make a positive impact on these families and communities is incredible. And I say that members of our organization tend to go through 3 different phases when they become a member of Project Recover. And that first phase is you're attracted to the mission for whatever your personal values are and whatever reasons that bring you to it. It's the right thing to do. You have a military background and you just want to keep on, having a personal mission or whatever it happens to be, whatever the individual reasons are. That's the first phase. And then the next phase is, they're going to go on these missions. They're going to participate in some way. And at some point, they're going to have their first discovery. And that could be the first mission, but it could also be a long time after they become a part of the organization. And that's when it becomes real. Well, now you realize, wow, we found this site. This person might have been missing for 8 decades, but you realize there might be families that have no idea that we're even out here looking, that are now going to have answers related to the ambiguous loss of their loved one, those questions that they've held on to for just too long. And so then that's the second phase, is this is real. And I encourage every single one of our members, when one of these MIAs that we are a part of that mission of locating them or recovering them or whatever part of the mission we are part of, when they are memorialized and celebrated, in their hometowns or Arlington National Cemetery or wherever it happens to be, that we do everything that we can to show our support and bear witness to these events. And you can imagine how life-changing it is for the families, but it's just as life-changing for each and every one of us that get to witness this and be a part of it. And then that's that third phase. And I was in the Marine Corps when I started doing this work, and when I left the Marine Corps, I was doing this work, and I continue to do this work with Project Recover. But I look at a lot of my peers from the military that have this perceived loss of value when they take the uniform off, or they're seeking out that next mission that gives them fulfillment, purpose, generativity, and things like that. And I know personally myself, I didn't have that feeling of losing value, and I always say that it's because of this mission, it's because of this organization and what we're trying to do that I haven't had that, and I see it in the peers that work alongside of me as well.
That's great. So I know you're the head of the organization now. Do you still personally yourself get to go out into the field and do missions, trying to recover service members?
Well, I'll say not as often as I want to, but
I had a feeling that's it.
Yeah.
That's what you were going to say.
Yes, but I do get to go in the field from time to time. I actually just returned from a mission in Palau where we were doing actually 2 missions in Palau, and then in May I'll have an opportunity to participate in part of a mission in Germany. But I've been doing this now for more than 2 decades and have grown in the organization. My role in the organization has changed from just being a member to a team lead to then being on the board of the organization, and now as the president and CEO. And my responsibilities have changed in how I advance this mission, but I still get the joy, and I get to get dirty and muddy and filthy with the rest of the team from time to time. But as I said, not as often as I would like to, but that's okay because we have some pretty incredible people that are advancing this mission every single day, and doing this part that some people wouldn't want to do. I'm happy to take it on if it means that we get to bring more people home and provide more answers for families.
Absolutely. So I know probably all of these discoveries that you've been a part of are thrilling and rewarding and emotional. Are there any that really stand out that you think really affected you? The first one, maybe, like you said a few minutes ago, but are there any that were just particularly, memorable for you for whatever reason?
Yeah. Well, the cliche answer is the next one, right? But I get asked that question a lot, and I can't say that one is more special than the others, but there are certain things and certain discoveries that really push the point home and are special for a variety of reasons, and usually they're very different. But the first one that I was a part of was very special. So I mentioned, how I became a part of the organization was through my former squadron 121, which is still around. 121's flying Joint Strike Fighters now. But it took me a while to go on my very first mission because I was deploying quite a bit as an active Marine when I first became a part of the organization. But I finally went on my first mission. I came back from a deployment to the Middle East. I came home, I unpacked a sea bag, I packed a suitcase, and I took off to Palau. And back then we were doing 1 mission a year to Palau, combing the waters and the jungles, looking for some of these sites. And we had a MIA discovery that year. We located a site in very, very dense mangrove, and it turns out that it was a member of my squadron from World War II, the same squadron that connected me to this organization. I became a part of locating one of those Marines, and it was almost something like you'd see in a movie or a book or reading a book or something like that. It just didn't seem like it was real, and I knew this case, and it there's 300 and something service members still missing in and around Palau. So what were the chances that I was going to find or be a part of finding this one? And then that turned out to be the very first MIA discovery I was ever a part of. And there's some absolutely incredible stories that have occurred since then. But of course, that one was the one that ultimately, I already had the spark and the fire within me, but it just was like somebody poured gasoline on the fire internally, and I just wanted to continue to be a part of this and be a bigger part of it. And now there's several incredible stories since then. But yeah, it's that one is definitely special, even though every single one of them is special.
Of course, yeah. And that would make a great movie right there. That's
Right.
something like that. So I know you guys were involved in a recent identification of a Kansan, actually.
Yeah.
First Lieutenant Herbert Tennyson, who was from Wichita. I think he was just identified here in the last couple of months, I think.
Yeah, very recently. I thought that the serendipity of having the opportunity to do something with the Eisenhower Library, and then the identification of somebody from Kansas occurs right before then. It was very, very special. But yeah, Lieutenant Tennyson was part of a crew referred to as Heaven Can Wait, a B-24 crew, and Project Recover, in our partnership with Scripps Institution of Oceanography and the University of Delaware, located that site in Papua New Guinea. And it's just a very, very special story too, like every single one of these. But it was pretty neat because we had been preparing to go to Papua New Guinea and start to do some searches in the waters off of their shores. And right before we left for the mission, we were contacted by one of the Heaven Can Wait crew. And something unusual had happened with this crew. It turns out that the families, the majority of the families, have been communicating for decades since this B-24 was lost. And that is pretty unusual, for all those families to stay close. And they had all done a lot of research related to the case and where it might be located. And so they reached out to us, again, just one of those. And I don't call it serendipity anymore or coincidence or anything like that. And actually, I got this term from one of the family members from Heaven Can Wait, because we've had too many coincidences that they just aren't coincidences. And so this family member says, they're not coincidences. They're angel taps. They're somebody telling you that you need to be going in this direction. And so right before the team left for that mission, representatives from these families reached out to us and shared the information related that they had to this loss. And so the team went into the field armed with that information, and were able to locate the B-24 site, which is just special in itself. And we actually had moments with those families after the discovery, being able to share some of that information with them, which is also unusual because typically we don't actively reach out to families, but we already had this relationship established with them. And so we're not going to keep any secrets from them either. And so we were able to share the celebration of this discovery. And then in working with the Department of Defense, we're excited about a quick recovery effort to take place. One of the challenges being that this site is in very, very deep water. So it's deeper than 200 feet. And so for a non-government organization or a nonprofit like Project Recover, that's getting into a realm that's beyond our capability. But the Navy has what's called the Navy Experimental Dive Unit, which they use a variety of technologies that allow them to work at some pretty incredible depths. And to keep it in layman's terms, basically they take a housing, a bell, or a living environment, and they place it on the ocean floor for an extended period of time. And those sailors work from that environment. And so we were excited about that effort to take place. And then right when things started to move to advance the recovery effort, we were smacked with COVID like everybody else in the world. Right. And that delayed those efforts for a while. And only recently were they able to get that dive team out there to execute recovery. And they were able to recover remains from that site. And now Lieutenant Tennyson has been identified, and his family will very, very soon be again memorializing and celebrating his return.
It's a great story. So I guess one question about that is so the entire crew wasn't on the plane when it went down, or was it somebody who had once been on that plane? Excuse me, and reached out and wasn't on that plane anymore?
No, the entire crew was lost with that B-24.
And I misunderstood. I thought you said you got contacted by a former crew member.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, it was family members.
Oh, I apologize. I probably misheard.
No, family members of the crew So I think almost all of the families have been in touch over the years. And it was Scott Altos, kind of as a liaison, who is now a Project Recover member, reached out to us. And his loved one, he's a cousin of Lieutenant Kelly, who has also been identified from that aircraft. Um, and he'll be memorialized actually this coming Memorial Day in Lancaster, California. Um, so yeah, not everybody has been identified from that site yet. It's still an open site, but some of the crew have been publicly identified to include Lieutenant Kelly and Lieutenant Tennyson.
It's wonderful. I'm curious about how you guys. I'm sure you must have to work with a lot of governments to get permission to go in to places to do these kinds of things. So, do you have somebody on your staff who is like a liaison or is in charge of your government affairs, something like that makes those approaches to other countries to say, hey, we'd like to come in and do a search here?
Well, I wish I could say we had a government liaison on our team, but we're not that robust. But you are correct. Almost all of this work, although not all of this work, takes place in foreign nations. We do work in the United States off of our shores, in our Great Lakes and our mountains as well, and I can dive into that. But all this work that we do overseas is with the permission of the host nations from which we're working within. And depending on the nations that we're working in, the process is different. But we do have to have permission from them to do this work in their countries, and we attain all of those permits. Now, if we are working with in partnership with the Department of Defense, sometimes we can work with them, and typically we'll work through the State Department and our embassies to assist with that permissions. But ultimately, we have to have the permissions from the host nations, and those permissions are pretty significant depending on where you're working. Obviously, we get permission from the government of that nation, but it can go all the way up to the top, and then it goes all the way down to the local government. And then, as you can imagine, if there's a landowner, we need permissions from them. If there's a variety of, sometimes there's parallel systems like a tribal system or something like that we also need to work through to get permissions from chiefs or other leaders to access and work in those nations. But across the board, we typically find success in attaining those permissions. Sometimes if it's our first time working in one of these countries, they might look at us a little cross-eyed, like, what are you trying to do? They might think that we're searching for treasure or gold or something like that. But once they realize that we are searching for people, very quickly we've discovered over the years that there's a values overlap, and it's not just our mission, it becomes their mission as well. And I like to use Palau as an example because we've been going there for so long. So initially, when we started working in Palau, they'd look at us like, what are these crazy Americans doing? They're diving in these places, but not the places where most people go scuba diving. They're diving in these really gross places that are mucky and silty and stuff like that. Don't they want to see the pretty fish? And but once they realized that we weren't, searching for treasure or something else, that we were looking for people, they saw the values overlap in when a Palauan dies, they're typically returned to the island from where their mother is from. And so in us wanting to bring them home, they understood that. Further, this is where the fighting took place. And this is the war-torn country from 8 decades ago during World War II. And they understand and live with the sacrifice that were made by these Americans. And so they wanted very much to support this mission. And we've seen that across the board in every single country that we have worked in. Now, there are countries with losses that, there's geopolitical things that we just can't work in. But the ones that we have had access to have been very, very supportive of helping us advance this mission. They know that we're not out there, trying to make money off of this or anything like that we're just really doing this for families. And once they realize that, they become very, very supportive. And I've found that, the impact that we create in the United States is very much paralleled in these countries as well. We've witnessed that there's this healing impact at the individual level within the military community, the obvious impact of the families of those that are missing, the communities around them, and ultimately all the way up to the national level. Well, when this mission becomes the mission of the host nation as well, this is where the fighting took place. And for them to have the capability to help us advance this and provide healing to these families and answers and maybe some sort of closure to these families, it allows them to heal in their own way as well from these kind of long-lasting wounds of war. And so it's pretty incredible to witness and to work with them to advance this. And yeah, just very, very special to be a part of.
Have you ever been denied permission to go into a place to do a search?
We haven't had a straight denial that I can recall, but we have had some places where it's a little bit more challenging to get permissions than others. And honestly, it's just different systems in different countries. And so, I mentioned earlier when we're talking about, we do campaigning, or what we call campaigning. So we go to these countries where we can work on multiple cases at once. But there's also another level of that campaigning, and having the ability to go back to countries multiple times allows us to build a rapport with them, trust with them to help further advance this mission. And we've discovered that, you first go back and you kind of go through the difficulty of figuring out how the new systems that you're not familiar with working with, how they might work, and getting the right permissions and learning their culture and how they do things in this country or that country. But then as you go back, now those relationships are starting to mature. And we've discovered now when we go back to more these countries over and over again, then they're approaching us with information like, oh, you're back. You should talk to these hunters that work in this area, or these fishermen that work over here, or we were talking to somebody at this museum and they might have some information related to X. And so, as I mentioned, it becomes their mission, and they start working on it just on their own and want to be a part of helping us advance it. So that's this other kind of additional benefit from going back to these countries over and over again.
Okay. Very interesting. Yeah. How do you, you don't have to tell me this if you don't want to, but how are you funded? Do you raise money? Do you do like campaigns to try to raise money for, to go on recovery missions?
Yeah, so we're a nonprofit. So like every nonprofit, we rely on the generosity and the charity of the public. And so we have a development officer and a team, I like to say a team of two, but of course, every member of a nonprofit is a development person as far as trying to fundraise and things like that. And so, so we're always trying to raise resources so that we can advance this mission further. And ultimately, the more resources we raise, the more missions we can do. And we've been able to continuously increase on that and build out, the stories, let people know, let the public know about the successes that we've had. And so, yeah, we rely on the generosity of the public to advance this mission. We are a partner of the Department of Defense, so when they ask us to do a mission, they will contract us to do that piece of that mission that they're asking us to. But like I tell people, that's not a good business plan, and so it's not enough to keep the organization afloat. We always have to do fundraising efforts to help advance this mission, and we are working on scaling this mission. And that's not scaling for scaling's sake. We want to do more because time is not our friend. So, as more time passes, these sites erode from the elements and time, but also human development around the world is encroaching on some of these sites. And so depending on where they are at, what countries they're at, who might stumble upon them may or may not report them. They might not realize that there's somebody associated with that site that's missing. And so we're doing what we can to really grow this mission. And we've had success then. If there was a silver lining during COVID, we had about an 18-month period where we weren't able to execute missions internationally, but we weren't sitting on our hands. So we took a step back and really assessed our model of the teams that we were sending to the field with the intention of trying to grow it. And so we have a modulatable model that has a core, but what we can do is we can take that core piece and then add onto it and then send multiple teams in the field in parallel to advance this mission. And since we've come out of COVID, we've been able to test that successfully. We've advanced our mission pretty a lot, I should say. Last year, we had a record number of missions. We sent 15. We conducted 15 missions throughout the year. The previous record was 14 prior to COVID. And if I have my wishes and we're successful, I'd like to grow that to about 30 missions a year. That would require some growth of the organization, but ultimately we're a volunteer-based organization. So the vast majority of the people that are executing this mission are donating their time, their expertise to do it. We have a small staff right now of 5, so I expect that would grow a little bit if we were able to get to that. But it's primarily a volunteer-based organization that gets this. It's an expensive mission no matter what to get people and equipment to the other side of the world. It's not an easy thing, but we are working also to advance technologies related to this mission. And we're frugal in that approach too. So, we have the honor of working with organizations like Scripps Institution of Oceanography, University of Delaware. We work with them to utilize their automated underwater vehicles and other technologies in the underwater environment that if we try to house those within the nonprofit space, they would quickly become obsolete. So it'd be very expensive to get our hands on one, but the technology is advancing so rapidly that 6 months later, it would almost be worthless. And so having partners like that really help us. And then on the land side, we're working on some new stuff with the University of Georgia, which, believe it or not, it seems a little bit counterintuitive. The technology underwater has advanced far more rapidly in the last decade than our ability to advance this mission on land. Wow. And so now we're working with some pretty cool stuff related to drones and a variety of other sciences that are going to help us in the terrestrial environment. And University of Georgia is one of those institutions that we're working on with that.
Great. Do you have any sense what your success rate is? I mean, I'm sure there are missions where you go out and you don't find any remains. Mm-hmm. How do you have any data or sense of rate or success rate?
Well, the truth is every single one of our missions is 100% successful as long as we bring everybody back safe. And the reason is we're not always finding a site, but we are always developing and gathering data. So we are doing searches, and if we don't find something on a search mission, should I say, well, we know that we need to go to a different location, or that eliminates that part of the area that we're searching. So we don't always have a discovery, and I don't know what the percentages are of every time we go out to search to discovery. And then on the recovery side, actually, we've been successful on every recovery effort that we've found, or that we've been a part of. We've been able to recover osseous material and bring that home. But I'm sure at some point, we're going to come home empty-handed, and that'll be tough for the team. But again, we're still gathering data, and if they're not there, they're somewhere. So we're going to assess the data that we have, and that's going to inform the step that we take next in pursuit of finding that person that might be associated with that site.
Well, we're coming up on close to the end of our time, but I think you said earlier you're going to be making a trip to Germany at some point.
Yeah, last year we started our first effort in Germany, and it was kind of neat because it was right when Masters of the Air was coming out. Oh, so yeah, so we got to watch that series as we were preparing to look for some losses to include 8th Air Force losses. There's a number of them over there, and just it turned out we hadn't done any work as a nonprofit in Germany, and we really wanted to put forth some effort in the Northeast, and kind of like, if there's a silver lining to COVID, we've discovered that. And, if there's any type of silver lining to the Iron Curtain, was that part of Germany just was sitting untouched as far as these efforts go for a long, long time. And so now we're trying to put in some efforts in Germany. And this is a reconnaissance effort. We will be doing some water searching while we're there, but this is primarily still information gathering, case building. So we're meeting with locals that might have knowledge related to any losses. When we were there last year, we did a lot of touring of a variety of cemeteries. And you might think, well, why would you be searching cemeteries in Germany? Well, a lot of Americans were buried in German cemeteries, sometimes hiding them. The locals were hiding the service members under German names and things like that. So doing research related to that, but also interviewing historians, fishermen in the Baltic Sea that might know about where they catch their nets on things, which could be an aircraft wreckage, to all sorts of different things. So we're building out our caseload in that part of the world, and we're really excited to continue to do that and hopefully bring about some solution to some of these cases, bring some of these folks home.
That's great. The reason I wanted to ask that question was, of course, we are the Eisenhower Presidential Library.
Oh, yeah.
So I had to get something in there about the European theater.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and Germany's not the only place that we've worked. We've worked in Italy, and we'll be doing, Germany and Italy are places that we consider part of our campaigning efforts. We've done work in England. We've done work in Denmark and the Baltic Sea. So we, you follow the lineage back to Eisenhower. We have plenty of connections to General Eisenhower, that's for sure.
Absolutely. Well, is there anything else you'd like to tell us or you want us to know about Project Recover before we click off?
Yeah, first I would like to say thank you for including me and for sharing the work of Project Recover, but also keeping the memories of those that remain missing alive in the public. And I'd like to say, I acknowledge not everybody can take off to the other side of the world, traipse through the jungles or dive in these various corners, but almost anybody can advance this mission. I already mentioned that we're a nonprofit, so we always appreciate the support of those that are out there, but we're a volunteer-based organization. So maybe you have talent, availability, and capability to advance this mission. And if so, we want to hear from you, projectrecover.org. And we also want to hear from families. If you have a loved one in your family that remains missing, we want to hear from you because you might have that one piece of information that we need related to the case. I mentioned the Heaven Can Wait families that reached out to us and they had information. There's journals and other stuff in people's basements and attics out there that we don't know about that might have just that one piece of information that you never know could lead to the discovery and ultimately repatriation of one or several of these service members. And so if that's you, we'd love to hear from you. And all of that can be done through our website, projectrecover.org.
Okay. Well, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. And I think this is such good work and such important work. And thank you for doing it.
It's my pleasure, Todd. Thank you for having me.
All right. Very good. This is Dr. Derek Abbey, the President and CEO of Project Recover. Thanks for being on today, Dr. Abbey.
My pleasure.